and welcome back to the Dreamcast. I am your host, Denise Walsh. I combine science, scripture, and stories that will inspire you to dive deep, break through your own personal glass ceiling, and design a life of your dreams. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dreamcast. I am really excited about today's guest because I silently, lovingly stalked him to be a guest on our show. One of the things that I've been doing over the past few months is really just asking for the Lord to put people in my path that align with what we're teaching and here. You know what I mean? You have a vision for what you want and the how kind of shows up. And so our next guest is kind of the how showing up for me. I actually was referred to his book through my friend, Carla Burns, and listened to it while I was working out. It's about a 10-hour audiobook, and I listened to it in less than a week. And my mind was blown. So I'm really eager for you to learn from him, hear his story, and hear what he has to say. But he spent 8 years of his life as a law enforcement officer, serving as a DARE officer in a sergeant, and was on a SWAT team, and was actually awarded Officer of the Year in 2012. However, after a medical retirement, which he'll tell us a little bit about, he is now an ordained minister and pastor of over 20 years. And he actually grew up in the Detroit area, just like me. We connected there. He went to Bible college. He has a heart for people and just loves to help people get better. And so it was his book, Quantum Christian, that said, oh my gosh, he's taking me like a whole nother level in my faith journey. And I'm so excited about what he has experienced and that he's getting it out into the world because so many of us will benefit from it. So without further ado, I would love to introduce author of Quantum Christian and more, tattoo preacher Aaron Davis.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Carl Burns, for referring Denise to my book, Quantum Christianity. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I know. It feels like we need like a audience. Woohoo! Yay!
Yeah.
So yes, Quantum Christianity. And that was the book that I listened to. And so what I did is I took a screenshot of me listening to it and said, oh my gosh, I Instagrammed and tagged him on Instagram. I messaged him a few times and put him in a story. And you know what I mean? When you find people that you align with, you're like, I need to be your friend. And so that is how I felt, Aaron. So for those of you who are listening who don't know much about you, would you mind just starting with sharing a bit of your story, and then we'll dive in to your book?
Okay, well, my story is I moved to Nashville, Tennessee in 1996. I was working with troubled teens at the time. I was a youth pastor. Actually, when I moved down here, I came to start a church in the Nashville area. And those of you who have done any ministry know that oftentimes the church doesn't pay a whole lot. And so I had to get a side job, and that ended up working with troubled teens. And kind of like a halfway house type of a program where they were coming out of the system and had to go into our program before they could go back into public schools. And so I did that for a number of years. And during that period of time, I actually was recruited by the local law enforcement officers because they were starting a school resource officer program. And I dealt so well with these teens who had been through so many different types of issues in their personal lives that they wanted me to be one of their school resource officers. And I quickly moved up the ranks. Within 3 years, I was Officer of the Year. I was on the SWAT team, promoted to Detective Sergeant. And it was 7 years in, I had a couple of guys try to kill me. So I'm medically retired. I retired in January of 2008 after about a year of physical rehabilitation. Whenever I was attacked, I ended up being thrown from my vehicle at about 45 miles an hour, busted both of my inner ears, and had to go through vestibular rehabilitation as well as having to deal with all of the emotional and psychological things surrounding the injuries that I sustained. And so, it was quite a journey back to normalcy after that. But that is my story in a nutshell. Shortly after that event, I started studying different things as it pertained to theology and science, and was always fascinated with science growing up. And began to study quantum physics a bit, studied a lot about the brain and the functions of the brain and how psychology plays into a lot of things that we do in neurology and different stuff. And so, really kind of being more of it was more of a hobby really than anything. I like to learn. And so I started studying these things and found a fascination with it. And somewhere in the process, I started writing down my thoughts, and those became a book. And that book became Quantum Christianity.
Wow. Okay. So you were almost killed, and if you listen or read the book, you'll hear that story in detail.
Uh-huh.
And it was the years of recovering, because you not only had to heal physically and mentally, but you couldn't go back to what you were doing before. So it was a true reinventing yourself and transition, and what do I do next? And okay, what's next for me? And I know this space is where you did a lot of your learning. What were some of the big breakthroughs that you experienced throughout the years of recovery?
That's actually a pretty involved and difficult question to answer, and I'll tell you why. Because anybody who's been through traumatic experiences knows that there are plateaus, I guess, that you reach in your progression. And myself, I went from being an arrogant cop. I really was. I fit a stereotype that I don't think is a fair stereotype of all police officers, but I definitely fit within the stereotype that a lot of people, I think, perceive, and that is you give somebody a little bit of power, and if they grew up with any self-esteem issues or anything like that, then it kind of amplifies those insecurities. And of course, I developed my insecurities young. I had some events take place as a child that influenced that. And then as I grew older, I grew and I got bigger. And so, I'm not a small guy now, but I think in a lot of ways, I still had a lot of insecurities that were connected to some of those childhood events. And when I became a police officer, there were a lot of things that I had to work through in myself. And one of them was pride and arrogance, definitely. Typically, before I was attacked, just about anything that I put my hand to, I succeeded at. So when you have a lot of wins and very few losses or even traumatic events to compare to other people's experiences, a lot of times I think you find yourself in a mentality, when somebody experiences something, basically, for instance, I judged people a lot who ever had anxiety issues. Somebody were to be in depression or have panic attacks. To me, I thought that was weakness. I just thought that they were weak people. And, because I myself had never experienced that, and I thought that I was probably definitely more than what I was, I would tell people things like get over it or, suck it up or whatever. And then having experienced that kind of trauma myself and going through anxiety attacks and levels of post-traumatic stress and different things, it awakened me to a whole different side of life and pain, and I really think it set a balance to my scales. As difficult as it was, if I didn't have that perception, I don't think that I'd be the same person that I am today. I really don't think that I would have been able to write the book that I did, or the books that I did after that season, because of there's just a learning that there's something that happens in pain, in deep pain. There's something that happens where you have an identity and a compassion and an empathy for people who have or are going through things that before you just thought were foolishness. I remember when I first started experiencing panic attacks, the way that I would express it to people is, imagine being attacked by a tiger and the fear that you would feel in that moment. And then imagine that that there's nothing there to be that afraid of, and yet you can't shake the fear. So you literally go through a cycle. It's a catch-22 of being afraid of being afraid, because it doesn't make any sense, and wondering if you're losing your mind because you're experiencing these things that seem so just irrational. That's the word I'm looking for. It's just irrational. It doesn't make sense. And yet there it is. You're experiencing it. So having gone through that stuff, it leveled some thought processes for me. And I can remember, to get to your question, and I apologize, that was a long introduction to answer your question, but you asked, how did I, or when did I reach a place where, there were some things that were starting to click with me about my experiences. And I can remember that step by step through the circumstances, I found myself valuing life. I can remember very early on, I thought I was invincible. I been in a lot of fights and hadn't experienced anything like I had after getting attacked. Always having that size advantage on situations kept me in a pride that I think I just didn't know what I didn't know at that point. And I can remember shortly after being attacked and sitting on my couch and realizing how many days that I had wasted or not valued with people or experiences or family or whatever. And I remember just sitting there and in tears, just tears rolling down my face, because everything was broken at that time. My body was broken. My emotions were broken. And I really just felt very humbled. And I remember thinking, God, I don't ever want to waste another day. And I think that was the first realization that I experienced about reality versus my perceived reality before that point, and that there were so many things that I had taken for granted. And then, of course, moving down years into the recovery process, this was a long process. I wouldn't want anybody to have to go through what I did, but it was years of recovery and getting back to a place of normalcy for me. And I remember about 3 years in telling God, I don't you think I've been through this a long enough time? Don't you think I've been here long enough? Haven't I learned what I need to learn? And I'm not one of those guys that says God talks to me all the time. I mean, we have conversations, but it's not like there are that inner voice that God speaks to you through. And then there are very, very clear, like undeniable moments. And typically those undeniable moments with me contradict my personal train of thought. And I asked that question. I remember I was walking to my bedroom 3:00 in the morning, couldn't sleep that night. And I was just frustrated with life. And I said, God, don't you think I've been here long enough? And just as clear as day, I heard God say, Aaron, you had a lot to unlearn. And it so offended me that I started laughing.
Like, whoa.
Like I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like in this moment here, I'm broken, like I'm coming to you and I'm feeling so bad in this moment. And that's your answer. It's not, yes, son, thy father heareth, or whatever you would expect from the God who's talking to you in King James. But in that moment when he said you had a lot to unlearn, I just started laughing. And I was like, all right, well, if that's what this is all about, then let's get with the unlearning. Let's finish this. And really, honestly, that was kind of the turning point, I think, in my life, where I realized that all of this stuff that I was going through, God was using it. He was working it together for my good, and he was helping me to become a better person. And I think ultimately a better leader now, a decade past it.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine healing on all sides is a long process, and there's times where you're asking why, and there's times where you don't understand, and we all want it to be over quick. But yet if we woke up and we were just better, we wouldn't learn the things that we need to learn. And you really did have to get like thrown on your face to learn some of this stuff. But now you're passionate about it. I mean, now that's the thing. It's not just a book, something you learned in a book, or you've experienced it over and over again.
Yeah.
So you have this turning point where you say, okay, I'm ready to learn. Like, tell me what you want me to know. What are some things when you started diving into the neuroscience and quantum physics stuff that were just like huge breakthroughs for you?
Well, that was a really interesting journey in and of itself. And I share a few of these stories in the book, but I can remember the Newtown tragedy for me was a big turning point. And I was already studying a little bit about quantum physics, and had a very I don't know how to word it. I'm not even sure that it was a real experience, but it was something that actually got me thinking a lot about about the possibility of things being more than what we maybe preconceived ideas have come to a conclusion on. And but I remember when the Newtown tragedy happened and all of those little kids were killed, kindergartners, 5-year-olds. And at the time, my son Rocky was very young. And I remember being frustrated with that event because in my mind, I always had the perspective that anything that happened in this life went through God's green light. Like, people would tell me, well, God's in control. He's, nothing happens in this world without his okay, so it's all part of God's will. And, I bought into that, I think, to an extent. And because I didn't know how else to rationalize it. But in that moment when that happened, I looked online and a friend of mine posted a Facebook update that said it looks like, and he's an atheist, so he and I had gone back and forth on a lot of different issues, but as an atheist, he said it looks like it's time to bring God up on some murder charges. And when he said that, first I was very offended. And then I was like, you know what? Honestly, having been a law enforcement officer, if everything that happens in the world goes through God's green light, then he's at least culpable. He's at least an accessory. I mean, if you rob a bank and I drive you away, then I'm going to be charged with robbing the bank as well. And if you kill somebody in the process of it, if I'm a part of that, that event in any capacity, then I'm a contributor to it. And so I started thinking about it. And I was like, he's right. If everything goes through God's green light, then he does have responsibility in this. And I was really frustrated with it. And during that season, I think God started to unpackage some things for me that religion had given me one perspective, but it didn't line up with the love of God from Jesus's perspective or what he taught. We see an Old Testament picture of God and we see a New Testament picture of God. The Bible says that Jesus came to reveal the Father, and yet my personal lens that I viewed God through was not the one that Jesus described. I looked at all of the stuff from the Old Testament. I looked at plagues and I looked at things, prophetic stuff. Elisha calling bears out of the woods and eating kids for calling him bald. Like that kind of stuff. And I'm going, how does this line up with the God of love? It doesn't seem to make sense. And I was in this process during that period of time of studying quantum physics and studying science and different things. And I was looking at God from an out-of-the-box perspective anyway. And I believe that by asking the hard questions, he met me where I was at and actually started to show me who he was outside of the box that we've placed him in as from whatever lens that we've resolved him to be in. Most of the people, if they think of God in a favorable light, they haven't experienced anything bad enough. And those that have experienced something bad enough look at God and they go, well, if you were a part of this, then I really don't know that I want to serve a God that's like that. And honestly, that was the experience of most of my atheist friends. And I had to struggle with that. I had to work through that. And actually, quantum Christianity was born in that season of really being vulnerable enough to allow God to see and hear the questions that I was afraid to present before that moment. Because after all, he's the God of the universe, right? So who am I actually to question God? But I found myself asking hard questions that I didn't want to face before. And he actually met me and right where I wasn't offended by my questions and helped me to see a side, I think, that most people don't see without actually having to face some pretty difficult realities by the resolve of the answers to the questions that I was asking.
What were the hard questions you were asking?
Okay, well, how can you be good?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you good? If this guy can go into a kindergarten class and shoot up the kids and the teachers, and you are the God of the universe, you're all powerful, you're omnipotent, you're all knowing, you're omniscient. So if you are these things, then how can you be good if you could stop that and you don't? And what I came to discover, and now firmly believe, it took a little convincing of myself. It took me 4.5 years to write Quantum Christianity. Typically, I can write a book in about 6 months. But it took me 4.5 years from start to finish. I did a lot of research in the beginning, researched a lot of science, researched a lot of things. And then going back and forth with God with some of these hard questions. And what I determined and what I came to, without letting we're talking about a book that's 300 and some pages long, so you're not going to get the full picture. And I don't want your listeners to think that this is all it was about. But one of the resolves that I came to was that God is not as involved in some of the things that happen to us as we think he is. The Bible says that Jesus came to restore that which was lost. A lot of people misquote that and they say those who were lost. And that's not what the scripture says, even when you break it down to an original version. It's not talking about man being restored from a fallen state of sin to just a relationship with God. But if he was restoring that which was lost, he was restoring the original intent of God for man. One was to have relationship with him directly and personally, but the other was actually to have dominion in the earth. And when Jesus came and restored that which was lost, when he said it was finished, it is finished on the cross, and the veil was torn and relationship between God and man was restored, so was that authority in the earth. And so, because of the introduction of sin, we have the wages of sin, which produces death. We have people, we have free will, we have choices. And all of those things are non-existent if man can't make a choice or if God trumps his every decision. Free will is an illusion if we don't actually have the choice to do the wrong thing. If we don't have the choice for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then we don't really have a choice. If God just simply said, don't touch this, and then when Eve went to touch it, he smacked her hand and said, I said no, type of thing, then it's not really free will. But free will comes with its own consequences. And sometimes your exercising of free will or your liberty will infringe upon my liberty. And when it does, then it's up to me to correct that or course correct in some capacity. And I think that's more of what we see. Most people, I think, blame God. They look at God for what's taking place in their circumstances, and they say, well, like I was saying, if you could stop this and you didn't, then you're a part of the problem. And I don't think that that's the case as often as we come to that conclusion. I'm not saying it's never the case. I'm not going to take the power away from God and place him in a box outside of power. But I will say that if he gave us dominion and he gave us free will, and we choose not to use it in the capacity that he created us to and authority to, by restoring the authority that, if we don't learn how to utilize that, I can give you a car, but if you don't learn how to drive it and it sits in your driveway and it rusts, that's not my fault that your car rusted. And it's also not my job to, technically it would be illegal for me to come and take the keys and drive that car if I gave it to you. And so I really kind of feel like in this life, that's what God's done. He's given us free will. He's given us authority. He's given us the ability to confront those things. He's given us the ability to hear his voice and to be able to navigate circumstances that many times might be our destruction. If he is omniscient, which I believe he is, and all-knowing, if he is that, then I think many times he's telling us, don't go that way. Don't go right now. And when we experience that painful event, we think, well, why didn't you warn me? And I think the whole time he was saying, why weren't you listening? I think that if God is faithful, and I believe that he is, I think many times what we're experiencing has more to do with what we don't do or don't know to do or don't understand. And ignorance isn't an excuse. I think many things we can learn, many things we can understand if we're willing to actually step outside of the box of our preconceived ideas or what we've been taught or maybe what generations have said God is or whatever. But I think many times what we are experiencing, and I'm not saying that the person, I talk about it a little bit in the book, but I'm not saying that the kid who was molested has a a responsibility to have avoided that situation. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying in this is that many times I think that most things could be avoided if the people that God was calling in that moment to be his hands and his feet and to hear his voice actually enforced the will of God in a situation instead of man enforcing his own will. And I'm sorry, I know I'm dominating this conversation. Interrupt anytime if you have a question or you're hearing something.
There's a lot of nuggets, that's for sure. And one question I do want to ask is, you talk about listening, which I think is huge, and that inner knowing, or that inner, when God speaks to us in that soft whisper, but sometimes we don't pay attention or we ignore it. And I remember even in your book, you said there were several times when you felt the nudge to not go down that road with these kids, or to not, to go back to the station, or, you felt that nudge and you didn't listen. So for those that are like, okay, you asked these hard questions and you felt like you got answers. I ask questions all the time, but I don't know that I get answers. How do you hear him, either audibly or in that little, what does that little small voice mean?
That's a great question. How do you, what I hear you asking is, how do I hear the voice of God to the point where it influences my life? And it's a learned thing. I think we all know that inner voice in some capacity. You might call it intuition. I realize a lot of times I think what it is God giving us a nudge in the right direction. And I think the first step to learning to hear his voice is reading his word, particularly the New Testament, because the New Testament has a different level of revelation about God than the Old Testament did. And that I go into that in the book Quantum Christianity. It's not that the Old Testament is irrelevant. It's just that man's lenses, I think, were more jaded in the Old Testament. They didn't understand. They didn't know what they didn't know. And the Bible says that Jesus came to reveal the Father. So obviously, if he came to reveal the Father, there were things that they didn't understand before he came. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we say, well, the many people will justify that God wrote the Old Testament through men. Okay, they'll say, it was written by God. I use different words, I think, to describe what happened in that. I think that anytime something becomes language, it becomes flawed in some capacity. I can try to explain to my wife what my love for her feels like, or my son, what my love for him feels like. But I think my son may be a better example, because he has not yet been a father. Mm-hmm. But once you become a parent, there's something in there. There's a depth you don't know until you know. And I love that kid beyond anything that he could possibly comprehend, and he'll go his entire life until he has his own kids, and then one day he'll have his own, and he'll go, "Oh my gosh, this is what my dad felt."
Yeah.
And I couldn't put it into language. I couldn't speak it clearly enough for him to understand. He would only understand in part. And I think that's what a lot of what happened in the Old Testament is that people understood in part. They only understood God through the lenses of their experiences, or to the point where they were able to comprehend what they went through, but they didn't understand God fully. They looked at him more as a God of wrath. They looked at him as a God of rules. They looked at him as having to earn his appreciation in some capacity. And because of sin, they were separate. But Jesus said he came to reveal the Father. And what that did is it made it clear that man up to that point didn't have a full picture. He may have understood in part, but he didn't have a full picture. So when God spoke to his prophets or through his prophets, it still went through the lens of their interpretation. And once it hit words, they might be trying to explain a feeling that they had or a clarity that they had. But once it hit words, words are imperfect. And so you can only describe it as clearly as love can be described. Mm-hmm. Well, in this situation, Jesus was saying, there are so many things about my dad that you don't get. And there are many things that you've derived because you've only seen a picture or a part or a portion of who he is. But let me set the record straight. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And then when we look at the life of Jesus, we see something very different than the Pharisees or the Sadducees saw of God. They looked at God through a different lens. Jesus came to reveal all of those areas where they had misinterpreted what God was saying. And so when you're learning to hear the voice of God, I think reading the New Testament is the first step, because you learn you learn what God's heart actually looks like whenever you read the New Testament. And then as you start to have those inclinations, as those things start to resonate in your spirit, that intuition kicks in or whatever, and you think you hear something, you can actually compare it to what the Bible says and go, okay, is this a pizza thought? Did I eat too much pizza before bed and kind of having an abstract thought? Or is this God trying to speak to me? And a lot of times when it's lining up with what his word already says, you start to learn, okay, in this situation, this is God speaking, like obviously. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit of trial and error. It's not an easy thing. And even now, as a pastor of 25 years, I don't always know that I'm absolutely hearing God clearly. So there are times when I know. There are times, like you mentioned, when those guys were planning to kill me, I knew the voice of God in that moment. He said, Aaron, go back to the sheriff's department. Turn around and go back. He said it 3 times. And in my arrogance, I actually told God, I've got this. I didn't know what I didn't know. These guys were in handcuffs, but I cuffed them in the front. I didn't know they had a weapon. I thought that everything was clear, but they had picked something up while we were out. And they attacked me with it. I didn't know that. But had I gone back to the sheriff's department, it would have made the next decade of my life very different. Mm-hmm. I believe God was trying to keep me from those moments. But because I didn't listen, and many times I think people don't know how to listen, we find that in those moments, God is using our circumstances and working them together for good. The Bible says that what the enemy intended for evil, God works together for our good. I think in those moments, God said, all right, well, this is the hand you've been dealt now, because these guys chose one thing, you chose another. And the wages of sin has produced this in your life. And it wasn't my sin other than me not listening to God at that moment. It was them having a hard heart and wanting to kill me. But their choices and their liberties infringed on my liberties. And in that moment, there's one. Mm-hmm. It was difficult. It was a hard situation, but I listened that day, and now when I hear it that strongly, I'm a lot more intentional to listen, because I recognize that at that time, God was speaking, and maybe I was just being too hard-headed or too arrogant. So it becomes a trial and error thing. It's recognize, intentionally communicate with God, and then you take that time to stop and listen and hear. You'll hear things, and sometimes you'll go, I don't know if that's God or not. But then he ends up confirming it somewhere else, and you go, oh yeah, see, now that confirms that what I heard in that moment. And then once you learn what that sounds like, the more that you learn what that sounds like, the more you're able to function, understand, and I think walk in a more clear understanding of that voice for circumstances and situations.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it truly is just trust in your gut and learning how to listen to your intuition, being quiet and not so busy, or we're multitasking all of the time, but truly sitting and journaling or writing, and then allowing those things to bubble up. And when I was starting to really dive into some of the quantum physics and neuroscience stuff, and really kind of increase this area of my life, increasing my intuition and my listening ear and things. One time I said, God, why did you make this so hard? Like, why is this hard? Why isn't this easy for people to connect with you? And immediately, before I even finished the sentence, I heard, it's not hard. You just have to ask. And I was like, oh, that wasn't me necessarily, because it was just me thinking. And all of a sudden this new thought came in, and I thought, okay, he's here, he's listening. And we just have to ask. And sometimes we do make it harder than it needs to be. Yeah. But growing that listening ear, settling in, trusting your intuition, and really kind of and following those nudges, I think you start to hear him even more. And you've started down the road of the science, you said. And It's interesting. As soon as I started doing this as well, I started seeing it everywhere. And so I'm seeing the fact that science is confirming what scripture has always said, to me, is getting louder and louder and louder. And you wrote this book years ago. So what are some of the confirmations or the science links that you've identified?
Well, what I found interestingly, when I started studying science was how much many people, and even when I would start making posts on social networks, I would say, I love science, hashtag I love science. And people would say, how can you love science if you're a Christian? Because they contradict each other. Science and theology contradict each other. And I was like, oh no, you don't understand. If you actually get down, if God created science, then if God created the universe and matter at a quantum level, at an atomic level, if he created those things to function within the laws of science, then they don't contradict each other. We just have to see where they connect. And that was what was really interesting as I started to study this authority thing. Some people would phrase it the authority of the believer. I think that comes off a little bit too religious for me, but being what it is, as human beings, as men, created in the image of God, I think that it's that if there was an authority that God had given us, then to actually impact matter. One of the things that stood out to me as I was studying was, Jesus told his disciples, they were fascinated because he cursed a fig tree and it was dead when they walked by it the next day. And he was like, listen, if you think that that's cool, imagine this. If you speak to that mountain, you've got the faith of a mustard seed, and you speak to that mountain and tell it to move and be cast into the sea, and you don't doubt, but you believe in your heart that what you said will happen, then it will. And they were kind of dumbfounded. They were like, you're kidding, right? Like, how can that be? And I actually believe that what Jesus was describing was the quantum world. Mm-hmm. I believe what he was saying was that there are rules and laws that have been set into motion that people they just can't comprehend at this point in history. But Jesus made it pretty simple. He said, believe and don't doubt. Here's how we start to do this. If you can believe it and you don't doubt it, then you can step into this realm. I call it in my book, I say faith is a force. I believe that it's as much of a force as gravity. And I believe that we as human beings, as men, women created in the image of God, when we begin to step into a realm that is beyond the physical and actually connects heaven to earth, into this quantum level, into this quantum space, I believe that we begin to actually have the influence to impact physicality. If you look at, there's an experiment, and I would encourage your listeners to reference it. Look it up and do a little study on the double slit experiment in quantum physics. And what they found, it's also
split,
the double slit experiment.
Okay. I haven't heard of this one.
It's called the double slit experiment, and it's also called wave particle duality. And basically, what wave particle duality in quantum physics, and it blew science's mind, continues to blow their mind because they still don't understand it. But in a nutshell, basically, what scientists did is they fired photons they put a film behind it. If you can imagine a camera, I'm trying to put this in such terms without visual aid to help your listeners understand. But if you imagine a squirt gun or a light gun or a flashlight pointed at a piece of cardboard with two slits in it and a piece of film behind it, much like a camera film or something like that. When they flipped the light on and they fired the light at the two slits, it registered on the back of the film that it went through both slits like a wave. So it came out from the source and it spread out like a wave, and it went through both slits. That was when they were just measuring the light hitting the back of the film. However, when they changed their focus to the slits and they focused on the two slits, the light condensed into a particle and only went into one slit every time. It chose a slit. So that's layman's terms on explaining wave particle duality. But what basically took place was, with human interaction and human focus, the focus of man, the particle of light shifted from wave to particle, and the only difference was the focus, where they focused their attention. So when I consider that kind of stuff, with man being created in the image of God and different things like that, I realize on this small scale that we influence what we understand to be the physical realm just by our focus in that one scientific experiment. And that particular understanding really kind of sparked something in me to start looking deeper into how much do we actually influence our environments? How much does our presence, whether we focus on the thing that God says to do versus the thing that maybe our sinful nature might want to do, or so many different avenues that you can go down as it pertains to focus. But maybe we influence our current reality, at the very least in this earth realm, because God gave us the authority here on earth. Maybe we influence our reality more than what we realized, and we end up placing blame on God or the devil or any number of other things for our experiences, when maybe we have a whole lot more responsibility than maybe we perceived before that. So those were as I started going down that science realm, and you can see, I mean, I'm running down a rabbit hole on this one. I mean, we are going into Wonderland on that one example, but that actually is where quantum Christianity dwells. We jump between the science and the theology, between what it means to be in covenant with God versus just having a religion, and going back and forth between the science and the theology to actually come to a conclusion of who we are. And maybe if we've been convinced away from God because we put him in a box of what we perceived happened, maybe we can believe again when looking through lenses that are a little bit different. And that's why the name of the book is Quantum Christianity, Believe Again, because I think between the experiences that many of your listeners have probably had in going to college and having a philosophy professor explain to them why God doesn't exist or how God can't exist based upon their I just lost my train of thought on the word. Philosophical. There we go. Goodness. On their philosophical interpretation of God. Maybe this will give you a little bit more ammunition to put the ball back in the God court and go, maybe I was looking at this through looking at it a little bit improperly at the very least. Maybe there's more than what I thought that I understood before.
Ooh, the double slit wave particle duality, you guys absolutely look it up. And I think the more that you learn about some of the quantum physics, the studies, I did one with my kids where we put two apples on the table and we put negative words around one and positive words around the other. And we spoke said those words to the different apples, and I took pictures, and I was kind of like, we'll see how this goes. And after a week, we cut them open. And the one that had negative words surrounding it got brown like immediately, and the other one didn't. And once you start seeing some of these things come out into like in front of your eyes, and then you read verses like, with the faith of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. And you realize that what we think, what we say, what we do is that energy that can impact the world around us. For me, I started reading the Bible with a different viewpoint, with a much deeper level. And I feel like it impacted my faith in an amazing way.
Yeah. You referenced the words. There's also a study that was done by a man named, and I'm pulling up the book right now in my Kindle. It's a New York Times bestseller, and the name of the book is The Hidden Messages in Water, and it's by Masaru Emoto, Masaru Emoto, Emoto. And what he did was he studied ice crystals as ice would crystallize, and he subjected it to a lot of different things, different environments, words, and different things, and actually showed how that people spoke influenced the water and how it froze and what the crystals looked like how they froze beautifully in certain environments and in other environments. And when words were spoken to them, how it looked jagged and edged and there wasn't uniformity in different things. Very, very interesting study that I came across while I was studying the quantum Christianity stuff. And just like what you were talking about, there's been a lot of studies that have been done with plants and different things, same type of thing. About how human interaction actually influences environments. And so, yeah, definitely an interesting study as it pertains to the words that we speak and the attitudes that we have and the things that we even think about ourselves and how it influences the cells at a molecular level. Very, very fascinating.
Yeah. And when you realize like God made us this way.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
like this isn't woo-woo stuff. This isn't crazy. Like this is the way that God made us. I've never thought about it in the way of authority or dominion. And that really is a really cool way to view it. Like it's our responsibility to do well with the earth that we have and to speak life into it and to impact the people in our sphere well, because we have the ability and the authority to impact
It's the story
matter.
of the talents. What if the talents that God gave us actually had to do with what we did with the authority he gave us?
Ooh, good. Isn't that so interesting to hear these stories, not from a Sunday school eye, but with the quantum physics view, because for some reason it just consistently blows my mind. And I go, that's what it was really about.
Yeah, that was, as I wrote Quantum Christianity, I had another and another and another of those experiences. It was kind of like so many things that I had come to a conclusion on. God started to show me an out of the box perspective. And the question that I asked throughout the book, and it was really, I think I asked it because I believe God was asking me the question is it possible? Is it possible that you thought this, but it could be like this? Is it possible that when God said this is what he was talking about? Kind of like I just did with you a second ago. Is it possible that that's what the story of the talents are? Mm-hmm. Is that the thing that we can waste? Do we take our authority and bury it and just expect God to do things for us when he actually gave us the talent and expected us to use it? And then when we stand before him on judgment day, is that the thing we're going to be judged by? Like, I gave you the authority. It cost my son his life to restore it to you. And what did you do with it? You stood around and you waited for me to drive your car. I gave it to you. Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff. It really kind of flips the script a little bit and gets you thinking outside of that box.
It really does. And for you go through years of quote unquote like suffering, like where you're in pain physically and mentally, but yet you're healing and you get to that rock bottom place where you say, okay, God, I'm ready to unlearn. I'm ready to relearn. But now you're an active pastor again. You're vibrant. You're thriving. How has this learning impacted the way that you pastor today?
Well, I think that for the most part, I think what it does is I just approach things with more of a compassion for people who don't know. When Jesus is on the cross and he looks at these men and he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I feel like a lot of times, and I'm not saying that I'm more enlightened than the next guy, or I don't think I'm smarter or anything like that. That's not what this statement that I'm making is saying. But I feel like God has shown me something that a lot of people haven't caught on to. And if they did, I think it could influence their reality because it influenced mine. Mm-hmm. I found myself it's interesting when you think, let's put politics into a consideration. When you think it's the government's job to do everything for you, and then you realize that actually you can make a difference in your circumstances, whether the government gets involved to the capacity that you thought they should or not. Mm-hmm. That's really, I think, how a lot of people view God. A lot of people are expecting God to be the genie in the lamp, and they hope that they rub it the right way so that the genie pops out and grants them their 3 wishes. Mm-hmm. But that's not the God that I've come to understand. The God that I've come to understand 2,000 years ago sent his son to reveal his heart as a father, to restore to humanity the authority that was lost in sin and the connection to God to be able to navigate life's problems with the introduction of sin with efficacy, because they have a relationship with the God who can help them do it the right way instead of trying to do it blindly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a totally different perspective. You know, it's instead of expecting God to do it for me, I'm asking God, how do I do it utilizing the authority that you purchased at a great price when you sent your son to restore that which was lost? And that's the difference.
I remember when I was working full time in my clinical psychology job, and I knew I didn't want to be there anymore, but I knew I didn't know what else to do. And so I remember praying, okay, tell me what to do. And it felt like there was a right or a wrong answer. I was either doing God's will or not God's will. And I waited for this genie to give me an answer, and then I could confidently move forward. And what I've come to know with learning all of this is that when we listen, when we let that still small voice speak to us and just continue to take steps in that direction, we already know, and he's already given it to us. And it's really a matter of, it's not this grand, right or wrong thing. It's truly what do you want? What do you want now? And then you can start walking in that direction, and the how figures itself out. But I think so many of us wait. And we wait for the sign, and then we take action.
Well, when I was in Bible college, I use this analogy a lot, because when I was in Bible college, the girls that were there, many of them were there because they wanted to marry a pastor. Okay. That was a lot of them. And you would watch them and they would be like, what if he's the one? What if I miss it? What if I don't, what if I'm not paying attention and I miss the one? And a lot of people think that there is the one out there. I think that, what do we got? 6 billion, 7 billion people in the earth now. I think that it's, which one do you choose? It's the one in 3.5 billion out there. And whatever you choose, God's going to say, all right, I gave you the power to choose. And now we're going to work within the realm of your choices. And if I had chosen to marry somebody different, my life would be different, but God would still be the same. And he's still going to work those things together for my good. I could have chosen the girl that wasn't the best for me. I could have dated the girl, married the girl that I knew in my heart wasn't the right one, but it would have produced its own things in my life. And I wouldn't have married her because it was God's will. It must have just been God's will. If you married her, he would have stopped it, or, something. No, that he gave you the choice. And then he said, all right, you made that choice. Now, how do we work within the framework of that choice? Is there a better choice? I think there is. I think that God is ever speaking, but we've got to tune into that channel and ask him the question, is she right for me or not? And then be willing to actually humble ourselves to the point where if he says no, when we want him to say yes, that we say okay. And that, I think that's where the balance lies. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting, human beings are so, intricately diverse, and yet so human nature is so the same with them. We all want many times what we can't have. We all want what's not best for us. But if we're willing to actually put that stuff down and say, all right, God, I want what's best from your perspective. Now help me see what your vision is. Then he works within the realm of our choices. And he says, all right, I've literally had God say to me at different times, you choose. I was like, well, should I do this or do that? You choose. It's like, it's okay. Whichever way you choose, we're going to work at it. It's going to be fine. Just choose, it's interesting.
It is. It's like, it lights a fire within me because I feel like it's so interesting. It's so cool. And then you can read the Bible with whole new eyes and you're like, oh my gosh, Jesus told us this whole time. So what are you doing now to continue to learn? Tell me your favorite books. Who do you follow? What are you doing to continue to grow in this area?
Oh man, I read a lot. I used to be a worship leader. And so playing the piano or the bass and singing, and I loved music. But I don't listen to music a whole lot anymore when I drive. Most of the time when I'm driving, I'm putting something in that's going to teach me something. I want to learn every single day. I want to learn something new. And I don't typically study the stuff that I think would be on most pastors' most recommended list. I actually study things that I don't believe. I want to know what other people think. I want to know what the guy who is an atheist says about science, just as much as I want to know what the guy who is a creationist same science. And so I listen to those kinds of things. I listen to college lectures. I listen to a lot of audiobooks when I'm driving. Mm-hmm. TED Talks, love TED Talks, just to, an 18-minute download or less of something that somebody who's a professional in some area, a perspective that they have. Who cares if I agree with it or not? I understand more of their perspective. And so I read a lot of those kinds of things, out of the box, fringe science, fringe theology. I don't know that I would recommend it to every Christian, because I don't know that every Christian out there is ready to deal with the things that cause them to question their faith. But I've questioned mine enough over the years and came to a resolve that now I'm just interested in the knowledge for the sake of the knowledge. And I already have come to a pretty good, solid resolve of what I think about God. So I do like, there's an author named Bill Johnson, who is a pastor out in Redding, California. I like his stuff. He challenges my way of thinking. And while I was writing Quantum Christianity, several people came and said, you need to read his book, When Heaven Invades Earth. And I was like, during that season, I didn't read any Christian books because I didn't want to be influenced in my thought, because really a lot of what I was receiving from God in Quantum Christianity was a direct download. Like, this was him challenging my thoughts. And then I would look something up on the internet or different things, and he would show me what direction I needed to be going. And so I didn't read that book until after I wrote Quantum Christianity. And then I went back and found the chapters that it was relevant for and inserted some of that stuff just as reference and to additionally help build the substantiation of Quantum Christianity. But I read a lot of Bill Johnson's stuff. I like to study things on the prophetic. I know that it can be, to some people, a flaky branch of Christianity. But what I've found is that, the Bible talks about there being prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers and all of those things. And I think that God's still speaking, and there still is a prophetic call on people's life where they hear the voice of God more clearly than others. I don't identify with those people often, because many times like John the Baptist, he ran around in camel hair clothes and ate bugs. And that's my experience with a lot of prophetic people. But they're weird, but they're right in a lot of ways, And so, and having been one who has functioned in that capacity and in different seasons, God has given me very clear direction. I saved a girl's life one time because God told me that she was about to kill herself, and I called her mom 500 miles away. And the doctors, she was actually in surgery. She had taken a handful of pills. I think I share that story in Quantum Christianity, but she had taken a handful of pills going into surgery and had intended to die on the surgeon's table. And she grabbed the nurse, and her mother grabbed the nurse and told them, while she was under anesthesia, to pump her stomach. And they did. And they said she would have died. And That was because God told me in that moment that she was trying to kill herself, just out of the blue. So I know God speaks with that kind of clarity. I don't hear it like that all the time. I know that he speaks to some people more clearly, more often. And so I actually study those people, these people who are hearing from God. I don't know that everybody that says they're hearing from God is hearing from God, but there are some that I've found that really have, they seem to have some sort of a connection that's bigger than mine. And so I want to understand what they understand. I want to know what they know, even if I never function fully to that capacity, because maybe it's more about their calling than mine. I still want to understand. So I'm in this season where I'm studying prophetic stuff and reading and listening to. There's a guy named Sean Bowles, Bolz. I think he's in LA. He's got a church in LA, and he's my age, and he's an interesting cat. I hope one day I get to meet him, because he's just different. He doesn't carry I have a little bit of, I'm just being honest, and I hope your prophetic listeners don't get offended. I have a little bit of an aversion with prophetic people, because I've been wounded by them a lot of times, because they've been weird, or they've been flaky, or different things like that. And as a pastor, you can sometimes it's just hard. It's just hard whenever somebody comes in and says, God said this, and God didn't say it, but they're demanding it because they're prophetic, type of thing. And so I've dealt a lot with that kind of stuff, and it's hard for me sometimes to find a balance in dealing with those people, even though I have a lot of prophetic friends. But this guy, this Sean Bowles guy, he seems to be pretty legit. He's different. And so I really dig him. I've served some prophetic ministries over the years that were very legit. Like the stuff that you saw, you knew wasn't fake.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way it could be. So from those experiences, I'm reading a lot on the prophetic. I'm continuing to study quantum physics. I bought a book recently. I think it was called 30-second lessons on quantum physics or something. And it just goes through 30 chapters or something like that of just different quantum, fringe science type of ideas that they built quantum physics on. And, so I grab a book. Whenever I can grab a book, I've got a little bit of free time. I crack it open and I read a chapter or different things like that. I'm studying the Bible in a different way now, being more intentional with really studying word studies and different things. And so there's a lot of things that I'm reading. And it could change from week to week. It just depends on what's out or what somebody recommends or what I see or what Audible recommends for me to listen to next when I've gone through all my books and I don't know what else to listen to.
That's fun. You can tell you have a spirit to learn, a hungry spirit to just continue to move forward. And what projects are you working on personally right now?
Well, I wrote a book titled Limitless. You can experience the freedom, power, and potential you were created for. I released it a couple of years ago, and it was a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And I have created a curriculum for it. I'm just about to release that curriculum, which has videos, and basically that book, Limitless, was written in a format to read a chapter a day, and it won't take more than 5 minutes to read a chapter for 5 weeks. And it basically walks people through freedom from the issues that have held them back. If you're a Christian, you know that there's probably one or two things in your life that you find yourself being set back by over and over again. I tell people all the time, the devil's not going to tempt me with a homosexual relationship, but he might do that with someone else. That's not my weakness. But what he will do is I'll be in a situation where maybe an opportunity for me to get angry will happen. And that's an area that I fall into really easily is rage or anger based on just my upbringing and things. Well, all of us have those things, those strongholds that the Bible talks about in our life that become established and become difficult to get past. Well, I wrote Limitless to help reveal what a stronghold is in our lives, to help us to see it for what it is, and then to get to a place where we understand our authority over that thing. And so the videos, the workbook, all that kind of stuff is going to be coming out real soon. It's going to be available online on my website. And as soon as that's done, I'm going to start writing Limitless Forgiveness, which is, I'm going to be sticking with this Limitless name. I think I've got several different titles, but I know several people who have been through hell and have figured out some way to exercise forgiveness in those arenas. And having been one that wrote the book that I wrote, Limitless, Understanding Strongholds, probably one of the biggest strongholds that people have in their lives is unforgiveness. It's the catalyst for so many other things that they experience in their lives. They don't understand what it means to actually walk out forgiving someone. And I tell people all the time, forgiveness is not saying it's okay, and forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. Mm-hmm. And so choosing to forgive in an environment where it maybe is not easy is where I think real freedom is found. I think it's probably the #1 area in the life of Christians where the enemy finds a way in and continues to keep people bound up, is that they just have a difficult time releasing offense. And depending on the depth of the level of that offense, sometimes there's a real bitterness that enters in. And so I'm gonna address that subject head on. I've spoken a lot on that. I've done a lot of messages on that, and I think it's time to write the book. So I've got a few people that I'm going to let share their stories in that book. I'm going to share my story about getting past forgiving people who tried to kill you and having to forgive them again and again and again after going through hours and hours of physical rehabilitation after you've chosen to forgive them. So yeah, that I think is going to be the next project. I'd like to have that out by the end of this year.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you again for sharing your story, sharing your wisdom, but then not just keeping it to yourself. Like, you experience it, you're a learner, you've always got your eyes open and you're ready for more, but then you put it together so that way others can benefit as well. So guys, check out Quantum Christianity. Check out Limitless. You can find Aaron at tattoopreacher.com, Tattoo Preacher at Instagram, on all of the social media channels, and check out his books, because as you can feel and hear his passion, even just through this hour together, that's what I felt go all through the book. And I can tell you, it lit a fire within me, and I know that it will do the same for you. So thank you, Aaron, so much for your time. And I'm excited to check out Limitless as well.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening today. Head over to denisewalsh.com. Enter your email to subscribe to our list, and I will be sending out an early bird special coupon. 50% off, in fact, of the Dream Life Workbook when it is launched in just a few months. So if you want to have first dibs, let's get your name on that list. Thanks again. I so appreciate you. And remember to dream big.